to have an army, not the other way around. And that's a peculiar feature of Prussia right the way through to the 20th century. The state, in the modern sense, grew up to finance the army, and the army always saw itself as the highest expression of the state. Its service to the state sometimes transcended its oath to the king, and I can think of 4 occasions in modern history when the army, in effect, betrayed its oath. In 1812, as we saw in the lecture on Napoleon, when General von York took his troops out of Napoleon's army to join the Russians. He had no order from the king to do this. 1848, an even stronger case, when General von Prittwitz deserted the king in Berlin during the Revolution and moved his troops out of the city to prevent them from fraternizing with the revolutionary Berliners. In November 1918, when the High Command forced the Kaiser to abdicate rather than lose control of the army, and the most recent case, July the 20th, 1944, when Colonel von Stauffenberg and various more senior army commanders exploded a bomb under Hitler's conference table in the Wolfschanze in order to save Germany and the army, but destroyed their ruler. So the Prussian army placed its own survival above the survival of the ruler to whom it had sworn an oath, because it saw itself as the embodiment of the state, higher even than the king. Now the Great Elector's success involved a kind of deal. The aristocracy agreed to the elimination of Parliament, which was, after all, the guardian of their historic rights, in exchange for a Junker, that is, aristocrats in Prussia were called Junkers, a Junker monopoly of the officer corps and bureaucracy. And that was a pretty good deal for them because, unlike the English aristocracy, the German land aristocracy was very poor. Prussia's a poor state, and in the Middle Ages it was known as the Emperor's Sandbox because it had such poor soil. So by the time we get to Frederick the Great's father, King Frederick William I, who reigned from 1713 to 1740, known as the Soldier King, Prussia had an army of 80,000 men, a standing army. Frederick William was a strict Calvinist who would literally beat those pastors who didn't preach properly. He'd take his stick and go up into the pulpit and whack them if they didn't preach the way he liked. He was a very stern, puritanical man, didn't believe in spending any money other than on his soldiers. So Prussia was a unique state. It was there to service the army and God, and that was it. The king always wore just the simple uniform of an officer, and so Prussia was actually a very cheap state to run. As we saw in Lecture 4, Frederick the Great, who was king from 1740 to 1786, transformed his father's realm, both in military and civil affairs. Frederick was the genius king, I think in some respects the most brilliant ruler of all the rulers we look at in this course. A victorious general, an enlightened despot, a philosopher, a brilliant musician. And his legacy loomed over Prussian history. What Frederick had done must be right. After his death, things froze until Napoleon defeated the hitherto invincible Prussians in 1806 at Jena. As Queen Louisa said, "We went to sleep on the laurels of Frederick the Great." Now, as a result of this defeat, a Prussian reform era followed. Now, the reformers agreed that they must put a soul and willing participation into the Frederikian machine state. Army reform meant opening careers to talents, the way the French had done, and that meant breaking the Junker monopoly of high command and letting bourgeois officers get in. Now, as it happened, the Prussian aristocracy outlasted the reformers, and middle classes were excluded until 1918 from aristocratic regiments. It was that you just couldn't get them in. But in this period, they had to give in a bit. It was also necessary to rouse patriotism to get rid of the French, and that meant liberalization of Prussia, emancipation of the peasants in 1807, and some sort of constitutionalism. Now, why was that? Well, the French army was free, and hence fought with enthusiasm. Prussian soldiers were serfs, in effect slaves, and were forced to fight. And as we saw in talking about Frederick the Great, half the army of Frederick the Great, it was said, was there to keep the other half from running away. So in order to beat the French, you had to, as it were, use their own materials. You had to absorb some Jacobinism into the system. After 1815, as we saw in Lecture 19, it's nice the way all these lectures begin to fall into place here, Metternich got the constitutions revoked where he could and reduced in importance where he could not. So 1815 marked the frustration of most of the aims of the reformers. Things were rolled back.